Welcome back to our continuing look at the Olivet Discourse. If you've missed previous videos in this series, they're all in the playlist here on the channel called Understanding the End Times, because for a lot of people, the Olivet Discourse is synonymous with the end times. So what we're looking at in this series is, what did Jesus actually say? What was he actually referring to? And then what does it mean for us today? So if you appreciate this type of long form, in-depth biblical teaching, or any of the other things that we do here at Disciple Dojo, we would really appreciate you showing that by subscribing. And when you do, enable notifications. All that really does help this channel grow. And it lets us know that, yeah, there's an audience for this type of teaching and to do more of it. So with that out of the way, let's jump back into Mark 13. We looked at in the last video, kind of at a big picture level of how different interpreters read the Olivet Discourse. And so now we're going to start working through sections of it a little at a time, because it's a whole chapter. So let's jump back into Mark 13. And again, we've got the Greek text here on the left, and then my translation of it here on the right that tries to keep it as literal as possible. And so the chapter begins. And while he was going out from the temple, one of his disciples says to him, and I left this in the present tense because in Greek, lege, this is in the present tense. And it makes the story come alive a little more. We do this in English, actually. If I'm telling a story, and I want to paint the picture for my audience, so I'm standing at the bus stop and this guy comes up to me and he said, all those verbs I just used were in the present tense, even though I'm telling you about something that happened in the past. And so Greek has something similar to that. And in this case, it's in the present tense. So this is kind of pulling us back in there. One of his disciples says to him, "Teacher, behold," and that's this word here, ide. Look, see, behold, what sort of stones and what sort of buildings. And some translations will kind of, interpret this a little bit like what great stones or what large stones or what beautiful, something like that. But the word patopos just means like what kind, what type, what sort. So anything beyond that is just kind of interpretation. And Jesus said to him, "You see these great buildings?" And Jesus does call them great, megalas. "There won't be left here stone upon stone that won't have been demolished." Literally, lithos epi lithon. Stone upon stone. Remember that. Verse 3, and while he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, they questioned him privately, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew. "Tell us, when will these be? And what's the sign when all these are about to be fulfilled?" So this is what sets off the discourse. In Mark's version, it's the inner three, Peter, James, and John, plus Andrew, who was one of the first disciples. And so they say to Jesus, "Pote tauta este," when these will be, or they will be. When will these be? These, tauta. This word is going to appear a lot in the discourse. And ke, what the sign, hotan, when, mele, about to be, or about to, there it is again, tauta, these, suntelestai, panta, literally, they will be fulfilled all, or everything. So this is what they're asking him about. One of Jesus's disciples made a remark about the temple as they were walking out. Presumably, that's how the other gospel writers put it. And then sitting on the Mount of Olives, oros ton elion. This is going to be important as well. Sitting on the Mount of Olives, katenanti tu hieru, opposite the temple. Now, this phrase has got some theological baggage that we're going to look at. It's not just haphazard. So what I want to do is give you, like we've done in some of these videos, again, a perspective on how different interpreters have approached this passage that I think are important, that many popular readings never really touch. And I'm pointing out three in particular, just kind of a cross-section of the past half century. William Lane's volume in the NIC&T series on Mark, that came out in 1974. N.T. Wright's book, Jesus and the Victory of God, came out in 1996. R.T. France's volume in the New International Greek Testament Commentary, that came out in 2002. And then Andrew Lepeau, Mark Through Old Testament Eyes, came out in 2017. And whenever I quote from any of these, they'll actually be colored in these colors on the screen. That's just a way for me visually to kind of keep track of, it's a lot of material. These are, 4 different commentaries, and these are just a few of the many thousands and thousands of pages that have been written on this chapter. So if you wonder, like, what's up with the colors, that's what it is. You can just tell if it's purple, I'm quoting Lane. If it's blue, I'm quoting Wright. If it's orange, I'm quoting France. If it's green, I'm quoting LePeau. So the first thing to look at is, why have there been so many misunderstandings of what Jesus is talking about in Mark 13? Like, why have people just assumed, they read it and they're either confused, like, I don't know what he's talking about, or they just read it as if he's talking about the end of the world, like end times from our perspective, like something that we're looking forward to. And so you get the popular end times teachers on TV and sermons trying to tie different things that Jesus says to events in Israel or Iran or Russia or China or any other end time scenario that is going to sell them books and keep you anxious. And so as a result of all the confusion, there have kind of been two misunderstandings like you can break them broadly down into two category errors. And N.T. Wright talks about these. On the one, you have pietism, and he's using that to refer to like what we might call popular or traditional or even a folk theology view. And so he says, pietism supposes that Jesus was predicting his own coming at the end of time, a prediction still to be fulfilled. So some interpreters say, yeah, Jesus is talking about when he's coming back, and obviously he hasn't come back yet. So everything in the Olivet Discourse is about the future. So that's one approach. But he goes on, Weiss, Schweitzer, and their successors, and these are German theologians and biblical scholars, have thought that Jesus here predicted the imminent end of the world and that he was proved wrong, because obviously we're still here. So you've got the pietist reading that's like, Jesus is talking about the end of the world and it's still in the future. And then you've got the critical reading, and this is popular in a lot of biblical studies programs, even to this day, although it's much less popular now, but especially up through the mid-century of the 20th century. And it's mainly by Schweitzer. Albert Schweitzer was like the main guy that popularized this, and people still to this day, when they read this and think, yeah, Jesus predicted the end of the world. Paul thought the end of the world was going to happen in his lifetime. All Christians thought the end of the world was about to happen, and then it didn't happen, and so then they had to go back and like reassess things. That's a very popular view, especially among critics, and it owes itself in large part to Schweitzer and guys like him. So Wright says, I suggest that both traditions, the old pietist one and the more recent scholarly one, are simply mistaken. And a lot of that error comes from people not giving enough weight to or really understanding the implications of all of the Old Testament passages that Jesus was pulling from. R.T. France says, the prediction of the destruction of the temple is plain enough. That's what the disciples first asked him about. But as the discourse develops, its language becomes increasingly elusive, drawing on Old Testament themes which are not as familiar to most modern readers as they would have been to at least a proportion of Mark's original readers. As a result, widely divergent interpretations have been proposed, and it remains the most disputed area in the study of Mark's gospel. So if you're struggling with the Olivet Discourse, relax. It's the hardest chapter of Mark. But France suggests it's because Jesus, he starts pulling from the Old Testament and combining Old Testament texts and alluding to things that are very subtle in ways that most people just miss because they're not intimately familiar with what he's drawing from. And so in commenting on this, LePeau says, we should also be careful not to impose our 21st century perspectives on particular first century language. And I love this quote. I had to put this in here. Sometimes too many layers of varnish can obscure the grain of wood instead of protect and enhance it. I think that's a perfect encapsulation of what people have done with the Olivet Discourse over the centuries. There's so many layers of varnish on it. Sometimes what do you have to do when there's too much varnish on a woodworking project? You got to strip it all away so you can get back down and see the grain of the wood, and then apply something that will preserve and enhance it and make it beautiful. And so that's kind of the role of biblical studies, is when you come to a passage that's been so encrusted with centuries worth of readings or misreadings, it's helpful to, as much as you can, let's go back and try to strip it all away and sort of start over. And only then will you be in a position to better understand and appreciate the different arguments, the different perspectives, the different approaches. That's kind of what biblical study should be. Like we should always be stripping the varnish, not because varnish is bad, but because we want to make sure we varnish something right. So this is kind of what the heartbeat of the Reformation, right? Always reforming, semper reformato. Reform viewers, you can tell me what I'm trying to say there, but you know the phrase I'm talking about. Always reforming. And part of that being unfamiliar, like reading 21st century perspectives onto first century language, part of that is cultural. Wright says, one of the main reasons, I suppose, why the obvious way of reading the chapter has been ignored for so long must be the fact that in a good deal of Christian theology, the fall of Jerusalem has had no theological significance. You know, I even saw this in some of the comments on previous videos in this series. I had a commenter say something like, 70 AD had no relation to Christian theology whatsoever. I was like, no first century Christian would have ever agreed with that. That's like saying 9/11 has no influence on American politics. It just is absolutely laughable. And that's because the temple was so important. Like this discussion started in the temple. The Olivet Discourse started in the temple. They were in the temple pointing out the big buildings and the big stones that it was built from. That's where they were when Jesus said, yeah, not one stone is going to be left on the other. It's all coming down. And that really shook the disciples. You know, you can read about the temple. Like sometimes we don't, because we can't see the temple. Maybe you have like a reconstruction in a Bible handbook or a dictionary entry or something on Herod's temple, but you can read about it. You can read about it in Josephus in Antiquities, which is his history of the Jewish people. In 1511-3, he has a whole section about the temple. And he says, you know, the temple was built of hard white stones, each of which was about 25 cubits in length, 8 in height, and 12 in width. He's not saying feet, he's saying cubits. Like a cubit is from here to here. So like 1.5 to 2 feet. We're talking about like stones almost 50 feet in length. Now, Josephus, was he prone to exaggeration? Possibly. But you can go today and still see some of these foundational stones and get an idea of how massive the temple complex was. I mean, absolutely massive. In fact, after the destruction of the temple, like around, I want to say like between 400 and 500 AD or CE, depending on which of those you prefer, in the Talmud, the rabbis actually talked about the temple. There is this line where they say, the sages have said, and then I put the Aramaic here so you can check me, make sure I'm not making anything up. But the saying was, he who has not seen Herod's building has never seen a glorious building in his life. And this is from the rabbis who were not any big fan of the temple authorities and the temple leadership. But yet, even within rabbinic Judaism, there was the recognition that like Herod's temple probably should be on the list of wonders of the ancient world. I mean, that's the magnitude that we're talking about. And so if you go today, like here is the Kidron Valley. So I took this walking from the Temple Mount, which is this side. You come out, you cross the Kidron Valley, and you can see some olive trees here. This is the beginning of the Mount of Olives, and it'll go all the way up to the side. I think that's Absalom's tomb in the background there. But this is Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, and this is the Mount of Olives. Here's the Mount of Olives looking directly across the temple, and today it's the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's like it would be behind me and above me from where I took this picture. But this is looking across. This is the Mount of Olives. And you can see all the olive trees, and there would have been even more in Jesus' time. But this whole mountain here is the Mount of Olives. And then up here in this area, not exactly, it's a little bit off screen, but kind of in this general area is looking back at the Temple Mount. So I was I think when I took that picture, I was like maybe right there, something like that. I don't know. But anyway, so this is where, not the exact spot, but this mountain looking over Jerusalem, and instead of the Dome of the Rock there, obviously imagine Herod's temple. This whole platform area, the Temple Mount, would have been dominated by Herod's temple, this gleaming white inlaid with gold and precious stones and just this incredible structure here. And this is an important location for a number of reasons, but in particular because of the Old Testament background to the Mount of Olives. Back in Ezekiel, you can read about this in Ezekiel chapters 10 and 11. Ezekiel sees God's chariot throne. That's the whole wheels within wheels and four living creatures. And it's literally God's portable throne, his chariot throne. And so in chapter 10, verse 19, Ezekiel says, the cherubim, and those are the creatures bearing God's throne, lifted their wings and ascended from the earth right before my eyes. The wheels were beside them as they went. The glory of the God of Israel was above them. So this is a roundabout way of saying they were carrying God, the glory of the God of Israel. And it stopped at the entrance to the eastern gate of the Lord's house. So if the temple was here, the gate to the temple, the eastern gate, would be right here. The gate facing the direction of the camera in this picture. So Ezekiel sees a vision of the glory of God coming out of the temple. In the next chapter 11, verse 1, the Spirit then lifted me up and brought me to the eastern gate of the Lord's house, which faces east, and at the gate's entrance were 25 men. Among them I saw Yaazaniah, son of Azur, and Pelatiah, son of Benaiah, leaders of the people. The Lord said to me, Son of man, these are the men who plot evil and give wicked advice in this city. So in Ezekiel's vision, and Ezekiel was a priest, keep that in mind, and he's in Babylon. Ezekiel's not in Jerusalem when he has this vision. In Babylon, he has a vision of the glory of the Lord exiting the temple and him standing there looking, and the Lord saying, hey, see these men? And he names certain men who were leaders of the temple in the time of Jerusalem's fall. Had Ezekiel not been exiled into Babylon, they would have likely been his bosses. And it was those leaders who were giving wicked advice in the city. You can read the rest of the chapter because God then leaves, like the glory of the Lord leaves, going east, and then the judgment is pronounced on Jerusalem. And so LePeau picks up on this in his commentary. And so he says, Jesus coming out of the temple, the east gate, and going across the Kidron Valley and up to the Mount of Olives and sitting down there, says this parallels the departure of God's presence from the temple via the east gate, after which Ezekiel declares Jerusalem will be destroyed. Jesus sitting physically on the opposite side of the valley mirrors his overall opposition to the temple itself and its corrupt systems, just like in Ezekiel's day. So remember, I said, take note of this when Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. That's what LePeau's picking up on. And just like Ezekiel and many other prophets in the Old Testament, Jesus enacted judgment oracles. In Mark's gospel before this, he will do one with a fig tree. He'll enact a judgment oracle on a fig tree. Is it because Jesus doesn't like fig trees or he lost his temper? No, he's doing something very specific, knowing what the fig tree stands for, knowing what bearing fruit should mean in Jerusalem. So Jesus, like Ezekiel, and Ezekiel did this probably more than, or as much as, certainly as much as, I think more than any other prophet, he would act out these judgment oracles. So his actions were theologically significant. And I think LePeau's right. I think Jesus's actions leaving Jerusalem, going across the Mount of Olives, and how Mark has presented it, specifically making a point of it, it's pregnant with theological imagery. And especially because Jesus is, like Ezekiel, about to announce the destruction of God's temple. Ezekiel's not the only prophet that had theological significance to the Mount of Olives. Again, here's a picture I took on my last trip, the first picture I took on my first trip. This is one I took more recent. I think it was back in 2018. But again, you can see all of Jerusalem. Like, here's Jerusalem. And by the way, Mount Zion, like you can see, this is not the tallest mountain. Like there's taller land behind Jerusalem, and Mount of Olives is taller than Jerusalem, or at least as tall. So whenever it talks about Mount Zion, it's not talking geographically, it's talking theologically. The Temple Mount, I mean, it's a hill for sure, but Mount Zion is the mountain of God, like where God dwells with his people. And if you don't know what I'm talking about with that, check out in the playlist on backgrounds of the Bible here on the channel. We have a whole series on the Sinai tabernacle imagery, which the temple would later come to replace the tabernacle. And specifically like the mountain part, like what that entails, why it's called a mountain, when clearly this is not a mountain. But there was another prophet who also talked about the Mount of Olives, and that was Zechariah. Zechariah was one of the more apocalyptic prophets in the Old Testament. Like Zechariah's writing, Zechariah, Ezekiel, and Daniel are kind of the closest that we have to what would later become full-blown apocalyptic genre. And, the New Testament example of it par excellence is the whole book of Revelation. But the Olivet Discourse has elements of apocalyptic imagery and symbolism in it because it's sort of like swimming in those same waters. Well, back in Zechariah 14, there's this prophetic vision that Zechariah has. And God tells him, this is verse 2, chapter 14, God says, I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem for battle. The city will be captured, the houses looted, the women raped. Half the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be removed from this city. Now, in the vision of Zechariah, of course, the whole idea of like how to interpret Zechariah, like what was Zechariah talking about? That would be a whole different video series. It's more important to see the content rather than exegeting Zechariah. The content was Zechariah has this image of Jerusalem being besieged and horrible suffering. And Zechariah wrote after the Babylonian exile. So he's not talking about Babylon doing it to Jerusalem, but that's what Babylon had done to Jerusalem. So it's kind of like Zechariah in this vision is seeing something on par with what Babylon had done at some future time. And so it looks hopeless. But then verse 3, then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights on a day of battle. So God is going to rescue his people. And then this is sort of the grand vision that Zechariah sees, and this is a fairly well-known passage among passages in Zechariah at least. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. This is the Lord, which faces Jerusalem on the east. So this is from the Mount of Olives facing Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives will be split in half from east to west, forming a huge valley, so that half the mountain will move to the north and half to the south. Splitting east to west is along this axis. So what's envisioned in Zechariah's vision is God stands on the Mount of Olives, and this whole mountain, we'll use the front-facing picture, God stands on the Mount of Olives, and this whole mountain is split east to west. So no longer do you have this, and this is north and this is south. No longer do you have this mountain ridge facing Jerusalem running north to south. Now you have this valley that is cleft as the mountain is literally split in two by God standing there. And why does he split the mountain? Verse 5, you will flee by my mountain valley, for the valley of the mountains will extend to Azal, long way away. You will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of King Uzziah of Judah, back during Isaiah's time. Then the Lord my God will come and all the holy ones with him. So the mountain is split so that the people can flee and get out. And God then can come and fight against the nations that have besieged and captured and looted and raped and pillaged the city. On that day, there will be no light. The sunlight and moonlight will diminish. It will be a unique day known only to the Lord, without day or night, but there will be light at evening. On that day, and look at this phrase, by the way, you see this repeating? On that day, on that day, on that day. This is a stock Old Testament phrase. The day of the Lord is used for many different events. And so saying on that day has this eschatological connotation to it, like that day. We would capitalize D if we were going to say it that way. Capital D, day of the Lord. So you got the Mount of Olives split by God standing there on it. There's no light. Both sunlight and moonlight have been diminished, but yet there's somehow light at evening, clearly not from sun or moon. And so that, bringing to mind images of Genesis, like let there be light. And then it wasn't even until after that sun and moon and stars were put in place. And so this is just kind of like, this is apocalyptic cosmic imagery, harkening back to creation. I mean, even the dividing of the mountain brings to mind the dividing that God does throughout Genesis. This is like the Lord of creation is at work on that day, whatever day it is. On that day, living water will flow out from Jerusalem, half of it towards the eastern sea, that's the Dead Sea today, and the other half toward the western sea. That's the Mediterranean. In summer and winter alike, not just during the rainy season when rivers do flow in the Holy Land, but year round. On that day, the Lord will become king over the whole earth, the Lord alone, and his name alone. This is Zechariah 14, and it's important to know that a lot of these images are swirling around in the atmosphere of Mark 13. But how exactly? Like how do we connect the dots? I think N.T. Wright has done a great job of suggesting what Mark 13 is doing with Zechariah's imagery. He says the force of the setting, that's the Mount of Olives and opposite Jerusalem, the force of the setting then seems to be that this was Jesus's paradoxical retelling of the great story found in Zechariah 14. In predicting Jerusalem's last great struggle, the coming of Yahweh and the final arrival of the divine kingdom, he was acting to fulfill in his own reinterpreted fashion the prophecy of Zechariah. As the discourse unfolds, what we're going to see is like most people have read Zechariah as like the end. And that very well could be, is likely what Zechariah was seeing. Like in vision. Now remember, in Apocalyptic, it's not literal. So people, like I have friends that are like, when Jesus returns, he's going to put one foot on the Mount of Olives and one foot, and it's going to split. And all I want to say is the imagery of Zechariah is beyond normal events within this space-time universe. Just like Ezekiel's vision of the renewed temple that he sees at the end of his book, these apocalyptic elements probably aren't meant to be taken in a precisely literal way. Living water flowing out of Jerusalem. I mean, could that be literal? Like, could God make a spring? Yeah, of course. I mean, sure, God could do that. He could split the Mount of Olives and, there could be a spring of water, and absolutely he could do that. But when you read the New Testament, you start to see how Jesus uses things like living water and telling the woman at the well, he is the source of living water, and her saying, what do you mean? You don't even have a bucket. And he's like, like people over literalize things all the time. And Jesus constantly had to correct them throughout the Gospels. And so the vision in Zechariah 14, especially in the first century, like the nationalistic zealots trying to raise up a rebellion against Rome, of course they're going to quote verses like Zechariah 14:3. This is like, if you're a good patriotic Jerusalemite, then yes, this would be something you're like, oh yeah, God's not going to let anything happen to this city. God's going to fight against the enemies and they're going to surround us. But just when it looks like things are going to be over for us, God's going to step in, split the mountain, and boom, drop the hammer. That's what they thought in Jesus's day. That's what the rebels that Josephus writes about, that we looked at in a previous episode, that's what they were banking on. That's what the leadership of Jerusalem wanted. That's what the people trying to incite rebellion against Rome wanted, because many of them believed it. Now, some of them maybe were more cynical, but many of them genuinely believed it. It's no different than it is today. Whenever any trouble happens over in Jerusalem, look at your Facebook feed. You'll start seeing people posting verses about God protecting Jerusalem, God fighting for Jerusalem. God will never let Jerusalem fall. Like it just becomes this apocalyptic, eschatological, nationalistic, God will save his temple and his people and his city. And our job is just to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, but know that God's going to come and he's not going to let anybody. That was just as popular in the first century as it is today. And Zechariah 14 was probably one of those passages that people would have turned straight to justify that belief. But here are some things that may make it worth taking another look at Zechariah 14 and then what Jesus says in the Olivet Discourse. Because first of all, before that happens, the city's captured. It's looted. It's ravished. Half the city's taken into exile and the others are holed up in the city. And then when God does come and to fight the battle, what does he do? He splits the mountain. Why would they need to flee if God's coming back to make everything right and win the war and vindicate his city and all of that? Like, it's weird. In the vision, why would they flee? You will flee as you fled from the earthquake. That didn't make any sense. And then living water flowing out of Jerusalem to the sea, both seas on both sides. So it's a little less straightforward than many popular readings would assume. And LePeau asks a great question of the Olivet Discourse that could also be asked of the Zechariah passage. But he says, if Jesus is talking about the end of the world, why does he advise people to flee? And let's be clear, Jesus does tell his followers to flee. In verse 14, he says, and when you see the abomination of desolation being stood where it must not, let the one reading understand. We'll talk about that in a future video. Then let the ones in Judea flee to the mountains. The one on the roof must not go down nor go inside to get anything from his house. The one in the field must not turn back behind to get his cloak. Like, get out, flee. Well, if it's the end of the world, where would you flee to? If Zechariah is talking about the end of the world, where are they supposed to flee to and why? So that's an important point to consider, whatever your view of the Olivet Discourse is. And it's also important to know Christians, according to church tradition, took Jesus's warning seriously. You know, Eusebius writes about this, says, but before the war, and he's talking about the war against Rome, Jewish war, 70 AD, the people of the church of Jerusalem were bidden in an oracle given by revelation to men worthy of it to depart from the city and to dwell in a city of Perea called Pella. That's across the Jordan River. To it, those who believed in Christ migrated from Jerusalem. And then Epiphanius also confirms this. He says, for when the city was about to be conquered by the Romans, all the disciples were warned by an angel to leave the city, since it was about to be destroyed completely. Becoming migrants, they dwelt at Pella. So when Jerusalem fell to Rome, for the most part, Jesus' followers weren't there. They had done what Jesus said. If church history is to be believed, they had done what Jesus said, and they had fled. They had fled to the mountains, in this case, leaving Jerusalem and going over the Mount of Olives, and then down into the Jordan Valley and across the river and just away, getting out of there. They did what Jesus said. So we're going to continue looking at the Olivet Discourse and you know, kind of taking it in little chunks. But it's important to realize that Jesus, in the Olivet Discourse, he's being asked about a prediction he made of something that would specifically happen within his generation. He tells his disciples to get out of the city. His disciples in the first century, before what happened, did get out of the city. And ultimately, just like the long line of Hebrew prophets of which he was the culmination, Jesus warned with tears of Jerusalem's destruction. And that's exactly what happened. God did not rescue that city. He didn't fight the Romans, just like he didn't rise up and fight the Babylonians. And so for Jesus, when the disciples said, check out this temple, look at these buildings, like they were amazed by this legitimately amazing ancient structure. Jesus, looking at it through the eyes of heaven, through the lens of the Hebrew prophets, yeah, in your lifetime, all this is coming down. And he linked that in some way, which we'll try to unpack in future videos in this series. He linked that to the day of the Lord, the coming of the Son of Man, and the gospel going out to the four corners of the earth. So stay tuned for more. I don't know how many videos are going to be in this series. This is dense stuff, and we're just going to hack our way through the undergrowth of theology and exegesis for as long as it takes. But that's all for now. If you appreciate this type of teaching, again, we would love for you to subscribe if you haven't already, and stay tuned for more on the Olivet Discourse. In the meantime, as always, keep training.